This is the second part of a two-part series on looking at women in this whole big series of living in our identity. So just in case you weren't around last week and just want a quick recap, because I'm going to be referring back to some stuff I spoke about last week. This is kind of like some quick summary of last week's talk where I went through the whole Bible. So I highlighted the importance of when you're reading the Bible, especially on topics such as women, is to look at the whole entire story in the Bible, to look at the big story of what's going on in the Bible. Not just to focus in on one or two verses that talk about women, but just to see the big picture. And despite the Bible being written at a time when the culture was so patriarchal, when women had no power, no status, apart from who they were related to, who their husbands or fathers were, God raised up women in the Bible to be leaders, to be warriors, to be entrepreneurs, to be teachers of men, and to be mothers. So despite being in such a patriarchal world, God raised women up. And you need to read the whole Bible to see that. And if we go back to the creation story, God created men and women in his image, which means that men and women are carriers of God's Spirit. God's original intention for the world, for men and women, is to be equal. And then we had the fall, where Adam and Eve were placed under a curse because they disobeyed God. Both Adam and Eve were under a curse. Eve's curse was to be ruled by men. Men's curse was to toil for their work. And you can see that being reflected in today's society by men having status in their jobs, to finding status in their leadership positions, in finding status in their material positions. And if they don't have that, then they are seen as failures. However, Jesus broke that curse. Jesus' death on that cross broke the curse that was laid upon Adam and Eve and all the future generations, so that we are now living in his kingdom. The trouble is, some of us are still living under that curse, still living like we are being ruled by men, or that we have to toil to gain our significance and status, when Jesus did it all. Okay, so if you just want to go to the next slide. So you should be familiar with this picture by now. And the overall aim of this course is just to kind of be aware of what's in this bit here, the arena, the bit that everybody sees. It's about increasing our self-awareness of how we come across to other people. Because we can easily hurt people if we're not aware of it. If we're not aware of our faults and how we come across to other people. Self-awareness is the ability to know oneself and to be conscious of how others see us. And it's not putting ourselves first, it's not reflecting on ourselves and spending all our time gazing about ourselves. It's just having an awareness how we come across to other people. Because that affects our relationship with other people. In a study, 95% of people said they have good self-awareness, which is quite a high proportion. And in reality, only 15% of that 95%, I'm not very good at maths, so I can't work it out, only have actually got good awareness. So it's actually a small percentage of people that actually have good self-awareness of how they come across. And it's an ongoing thing. So how self-aware do you think you are? How self-aware are you of your faults that can hurt other people? As followers of Jesus, we are meant to be on this lifelong journey of transformation. 2 Corinthians 3 says this, "And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit." And then Romans 12 says this, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good and perfect will. Sadly, there are so many Christians who think they're already perfect, that they've got it all sorted and they don't need a change. And do you know how damaging that is to people? These are the Christians who are leaving a trail of destruction and pain for other people. But as his followers, we must continually allow God to change us from our old ways. And this is where tools like the Johari's window helps us. Because we want to get the bit that's not known to us out in the open. It's uncomfortable, it's painful, but it's worth it in the end. Because if we're honest, everybody carries something that can end up hurting other people. There's bits of our personalities. Everybody has got different personalities, and that's a great thing. But some of our personalities can rub against other people who are opposite to us, and that can be quite hard. For example, I don't like being tied down to doing certain things. Following a strict set of rules just terrifies me, and actually I will resist against it. But I know there are people who need that order, who need to know exactly what is going on. And I have to learn to find a way of working with that person. And they need to find a way of working with each other without causing offense, without hurting one another. But that's the way we're wired. If we're wired the same way, the world's going to be a boring, uninteresting way. So we need to be aware of how we're wired and how we can work with other people who are wired differently to us. And I know this series we've been going through over the last couple of weeks has been so challenging to people. And I want to say thank you. Thank you to all the brave people who've come forward and said they've been challenged by this, who've been brave enough to say that they have felt seen by some of the things that we have spoken about. I also know there are people who've been offended by what we have been saying, partly because we have been challenging some of the teachings that have been so deeply rooted in their faith. And if you have been offended, that's great. Thank you for taking offense. But now it's up to you to decide what to do with that offense. You're going to take it to God. You're going to read the Bible and actually examine what it says. You know, we could be wrong. Because humans have wrongly interpreted the Bible for centuries. But we need to read the Bible with the Holy Spirit. And there are a few of you who this series has just been another series. And you think you've got it all sorted and you're not being challenged by anything. And if you really haven't been challenged by anything that we said, that's great. But are you prepared to go to a trusted friend and say, actually, is there any way that I'm being misogynistic towards women? Is there any behaviors in me that is toxic? Are you prepared to have that conversation with somebody? Because if we're honest, nobody's perfect in this place. We're all a work in progress. And thankfully, God uses broken people for his kingdom. James 1, from chapter 22, from verse 22, says this is from the Message version. Don't fool yourself into thinking that you are a listener when you are anything but, letting the word go in one ear and out the other. Act on what you hear. Those who hear and don't act are like those who glance in the mirror and walk away, and 2 minutes later have no idea who they are or what they look like. But whoever catches a glimpse of the revealed counsel of God, the free life, even out of the corner of the eye, and sticks with it, is no distracted scatterbrain, but a man of women with action. That person finds delight and affirmation in that action. Anyone who sets himself up as religious by talking a good game is self-deceived. This kind of religion is hot air and only hot air. Real religion, the kind that passes muster before God, the Father, is this: to reach out for the homeless and loveless in their plight and guard against corruption of a godless world. I want you to keep this passage in your mind as we read, as I continue to talk. And we've just been singing the song, The Real Thing. And I just love this song because it speaks of actually what we want to do. We want the real thing. And in this song, there's a lyric that says, break the pride that hinders us. Are we ready to break the pride in our lives? We're all prideful. But breaking that pride means that we've got to admit that we're not perfect. That pride is our barrier to God. And we need to drop that barrier so that we can come face to face to our Heavenly Father. And when we encounter Jesus, we cannot help but be changed. He leaves a mark on our lives. So do we believe that men and women are equal and should have the same opportunities open before them? Is that something you believe? Is it something you say? Is it something you say to your children, that men and women are equal and have the same opportunities? Does our conscious and subconscious behaviors reflect that? Do you give women extra encouragement when they're just doing their job? Do you treat them differently to their male counterparts and give them more encouragement and just, I want to encourage them because they're doing such a great job, and ignore the man doing the same job? Are you prepared to criticize a woman, to give them negative feedback? Do you find it easier to do it with a man knowing they're not going to cry? Because that's treating men and women as different. So I want to share my story. I was born in the 80s, and at the time, the UK had its first female prime minister. Okay, forget about her politics, but we had our first female prime minister, and it was great because we were told, like, girls can be whatever we want to be. You know, we can even be the prime minister if we really wanted to be. It was like the glass ceiling for women had been broken. There was no limit on what job or what role we could be. And that's kind of the message we got through from media and through schools a little bit. But the reality was, and especially being grown up in a church, that all the leadership in my life was male. And men did all the teaching. They were the ones in positions of responsibility. Women's roles were limited to the more traditional women's roles of doing children's work, doing the hospitality. Occasionally they were allowed to play the piano in worship times, but it's actually a man who still led worship. And during my teenage years, I experienced the occasional women preacher coming up and teaching us in church. And it was treated more of as a novelty, rather than this was a serious person to be believed. You know, there were still no senior leaders in my church. And this was around the same time as women being allowed to be vicars in the Church of England. And then we had the Vicar of Dibley come on TV. But she was treated as a comic character, not to be taken seriously. So here we had a woman in leadership in the church that everybody saw on TV, yet she was a joke. And it kind of said, well, actually, that's not serious. Women cannot be leaders because they're not taken seriously. And then I left Milton Keynes and went to university. And I got a degree. And when I came back into my church, they were like, so when are you going to find a husband, settle down and have kids? They didn't really care the fact I had a degree and possibly wanted to pursue a career. My next stage was then to settle down, have kids. And those comments were actually made by women. They weren't actually impressed with the fact that I got a degree and maybe wanting to pursue a career. So I was told and reaffirmed that my role as a woman wasn't to do whatever position it was God was calling me to be. It was to be a mum. Now, I'm not saying that is not a significant role. But that's not a calling on everybody's life. God has got a unique role and gifting for every single person in this church. And our cultural expectations for a woman in a church is to become a mum. And so in my early adulthood, I started to see more women in leadership. But what I started to notice, what these women were in leadership, but they were also married to somebody in leadership. Which as a single person was like, well, that disqualifies me. But I started to see good female women preaching. I started to see good female women leading worship. But it wasn't necessarily because they were female, it's because actually they were gifted. And I started to go, well, maybe I can do this. Maybe this is a possibility. However, I experience more misogyny in Christian settings than I do in the secular world. And on a regular basis. Pretty much weekly, if I'm going to be honest. I have been in rooms in church settings where I am the only Christian woman. And I'm probably the most experienced and the most qualified to talk about a particular issue we're discussing or being involved in. Yet all my ideas, all my teachings, it has been dismissed just on the fact that I'm a woman. And I had to sit there and listen to men telling me how to do my job, telling me the things that I'm doing wrong, but actually they're doing it wrong. Because I've got the background, I've got the teaching, I've got the experience of working professionally in these settings. So 20 years ago, when I was at university, I wouldn't actually call myself a feminist. In fact, I didn't really like the name feminist. Because my impression of a feminist was somebody who hated men, and going out and protest and burning bras and all that kind of nonsense. And I kind of remember doing an assignment, and my teacher was quite impressed, just like going, because I decided to argue it from the feminist point of view. And it's like, I wasn't expecting that from you because you're also a Christian, and I don't expect Christians to be feminist. And I was like, oh, okay. I mean, I just kind of thought that I didn't like being feminist because I didn't like the way feminists were being portrayed in the media, and I didn't want to be one of those women. But I had a lecturer who said, I didn't expect you to argue something from a feminist point of view because you're a Christian. And then I kind of started reading. Started reading the Bible, because that's always a good place to start. And reading different commentaries and books on the role of women in church. And part of my healing process over the last couple of years, because God's just taken me on this crazy journey, and is actually discovering for myself what God says in the Bible about women and the role of women. And I've actually read stuff from both sides of the argument. And the more I read, the more I see God sees women as equal to men. So one of the problems concerning the role of the women in the Bible is Paul. I love Paul. I love reading his stuff. But we need to remember that when we're reading Paul, when we're reading anything in the Bible, he's writing letters to a particular church at a particular time in a particular culture. That is completely different to our culture today. So there are things that we cannot apply to our lives because they don't make sense in today's society. And sometimes he's talking about particular events that are happening in that church that are not happening right here, right now. And it's also important to read his letters as they were meant to be read. They were sermons. So you read them from the start to the end. They weren't meant to be read as like little tiny chunks as we often take his letters. They had no chapter and verse when they were written. They had no breaks. It was just one continuous scroll. Those chapters and verses and those breaks and those subject headings are a relative recent addition to the scripture. So Paul's letters were written when the Roman Empire was becoming increasingly insecure about the growing populations of men of foreign cultures influencing Roman society. Derek Morphew said, time was like the xenophobic reactions to the immigrant communities of Europe and South Africa today. The Romans were scared of the Christians changing their culture. And Paul writes that we are to live as foreigners and exiles to represent the gospel well within the societal structures of the time. 1 Peter 2 from verse 11, Paul writes this. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to command those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom to cover up for evil. Live as God's slaves and show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers, fear God, and honor the emperor. So this is the context that Paul writes of the next bit. And this is 1 Peter 3. Remember, this was not a separate chapter in the book. And Paul's writing this, that we need to live godly lives to reflect the gospel good. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words, but by the behavior of wives. When they see the purity and reverence of your lives, your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry and fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past, who put their hope in God, used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are his daughters, and if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as a weaker partner, and heirs with you as a gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Now that is incredibly hard, and I struggled so much with this passage for such a long time, because whenever I heard it taught, it was taught just on its own. And the context was, women, you need to submit to men. You need to make sure that you don't wear makeup, you don't wear jewelry, you kind of dress yourself down. And then there's a little bit that says that the women are the weaker partner. But if you read it in the whole context of the whole bit, with the bit in chapter 2 that I mentioned earlier, we need to live our lives that reflects the gospel of God well. And actually what Paul was asking the women and husbands and wives in his church family to do was actually completely radical compared to how society treated women back in the day. So to understand this passage correctly, you also need to understand the structure of the Roman family, because it's not the typical family unit that we have today. So Roman families, you had the man who ruled the whole family and the children. And sometimes they had slaves if they could afford it. Aristotle said, the rule of the household is a monarchy. The husband and father are a king. So the typical age for a man to marry in Roman times was around 30. And they had plenty of years to go out, do their thing. They were socially and economically able to sustain themselves as a person. You know, they didn't actually need women. They could live their lives without having a woman. But women were married often before they were 18. Often their husbands were twice their age. The women weren't educated. they had no means of financially supporting themselves, so they needed somebody to support them. And she had no real life outside her family home. Her job was just to produce kids. And subordination was a norm for families at this time, and abuse was a common part of family life. Taryn Williams, in his book, wrote this: Paul is not creating a domestic structure in which the senior man rules everything else any more than he creates a governmental structure in which Caesar is Lord of the Roman Empire. He is merely speaking to it, trying to work within the existing social structures by finding a way to redeem them, and not necessarily by trying to overthrow them. Like any good missionary today, they would do as they enter a new culture. Paul accommodated to what he could, even though he did not necessarily endorse it as an ideal. So I could go on so many other passages where Paul appears to contradict himself. But this is why it's so important to read the Bible as a whole, to understand the culture of the time and what was going on in that particular church that Paul was writing to. For example, in that passage we just read, Paul never said that women shouldn't wear makeup or wear jewelry. It shouldn't become part of their identity. You know, there are women who spend the time, just all their money on making sure they look really good and all their makeup. And it's all they talk about and it's all they do. It's all who they are, and everything revolves around how they look. Paul's saying, don't do that, because you're more than that. It shouldn't become who you are. But also we need to love ourselves, and if we want to wear nice clothes, I think he's saying we can. Just don't make it a thing. So there's also a myth that women are the weaker sex, which is not helped by this passage at all, by Paul calling women the weaker partner or the weaker vessel in this passage. Firstly, the word weaker can be translated as delicate or precious. Something treated with respect and honor, not abused, as was the norm 2,000 years ago. Paul was saying to Roman husbands, do not abuse your wives, but to love them instead. Now that seems like a really normal kind of reaction to husbands and wives. You need to love your wives, husbands. And I'm like, yeah, that's what husbands are meant to do. But in the Roman times, they didn't. Love wasn't part of marriage. It wasn't seen as an essential thing for marriage. So what would Paul say about how our families are run today? That's quite a hard question to answer. The superwoman, who is described in Proverbs 31, says this: she set about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for the task. So women can be physically strong enough to do physical labor. I don't know what her physical labor was, but I would kind of imagine her also doing that while carrying a child or two. There's like folk stories that are around in our culture about how a woman needs to have a knight in shining armor to be rescued by a man. You know, we have stories like Sleeping Beauty and Snow White, and we have this handsome prince that comes and rescues the princess. And as kids, we're kind of told that this is norm, this is what we need to aspire for. As women, we want our handsome prince to come and rescue us. And even if we're not listening to those fairy tales anymore, you just need to watch films in Hollywood, where the woman is quite often rescued in some way by a man. Or they have the notion that a man can make a woman whole and complete. But we only have room for one knight in shining armor. And that knight in shining armor doesn't come riding on a stallion. He comes riding on a donkey, wearing a crown of thorns. Jesus is the only savior we need. Acts 4 says, only Jesus has the power to save. His name is the only one in all the world that can save anyone. Jesus is the only person who can make us significant. He gives us significance. He is the only person who can make us whole. He is the only person that can save us. He is the only person we need to worship. And we see this myth being lived out in various ways. Some women believe that they are actually physically weak, and they need men to do things for them. Or they believe they can't do everything, and they need a man to help them with things like finance or understanding technology and stuff like that. Now, I'm not saying that we need to be experts in everything. Nobody's an expert in everything. Men aren't the expert in everything. But we are capable of doing more than we think. We've just been told by society that we can't. I see a lot of women who lack the confidence to go out and do things on their own. There are women who are busy waiting to be rescued by a man. You know, they may be single and all they're doing is, I just need a man to make my life complete. I just need a man and then I can get on with my life. And that's just a lie. Your life starts when you're single. And being married, I'm told, is not perfect. And I think there's a myth that's, especially in church, that if you're single and you're female, then you're going to find your completion in being married. And everything's going to be a bed of roses. But actually it's hard, because you've got to learn to live with somebody 24/7. And we need to acknowledge that actually marriage doesn't give us all the answers, doesn't give us all the solutions. And I better stop talking on that, because it's next week's talk. But as we looked last week, women can lead men. They're strong enough to be warriors, educated enough to teach men, because God placed women such as Deborah, Jael, Miriam, and Priscilla in this position. And he places you in a positions to be used by him. Once a month, many women suffer from painful periods. And yes, I'm talking about periods again. And crazy hormones. Yet we carry on our lives as if it's perfectly normal. And for a few days a month, we suffer in silence. Because that's what we've been told to do. But it actually takes a lot of strength to do that. There are times when I don't want to get out of bed. But I get out of bed because I've got commitments. And I believe that if men actually were to suffer from periods every month, that the cure for the side effects would be found a long time ago. And then there's childbirth, which I have never experienced. I've seen one episode of One Born Every Minute, and that was enough. Every woman who has given birth to a child is a hero. And they need to be given all the medals. Women's bodies are incredible, and they do incredible things to bring life in. And I'm approaching the age where, coming up to menopause, approaching perimenopause. And while I'm kind of like, yes, periods are going to finish, it's going to be amazing, I know I've got to get through this whole crazy period that I'm kind of terrified at the same time. And all the other emotions that go with it. So I'm doing lots of research on how to get through it and not go completely mad. How I'm going to reduce symptoms and stuff like that. And I am so glad that our generation and younger are more prepared to talk about these subjects. There's no longer going to be taboo. And actually, in my research, one of the things that a woman can do to reduce symptoms is actually to lift heavy. Because it helps reduce the risk of osteoporosis, which is a side effect of menopause, helps increase your balance, and it raises your estrogen levels, which stops you going crazy. And by lifting heavy weights, you don't actually get muscly, it's down to your diet. And I don't think, if that wasn't part of God's plan for our bodies, that we need to be lifting heavy in order to reduce our menopause symptoms, then why are we encouraged not to as society? So women, get yourselves to the gym. I expect to see you there on Tuesday. So women, you are mentally and physically stronger than you realize. Men, how do you perpetuate this myth that women need rescuing by a knight in shining armour. I think men will often help a woman, often without asking. So I play the keyboard, and I have to carry heavy equipment around all the time. And I know I can carry this heavy equipment. You know, my keyboard is actually half the weight of what I lift in the gym. So it's well within my limits. I know my limits. It's just the same size of me, which makes it awkward. But there have been so many times when I have been moving my keyboard really easily, not needing any help, and there have been men who've just come and taken it off me. And then struggle with it, which also makes me laugh. I've worked out a way of getting my keyboard into my boot of my car without any help, because I do it so often. And there was this one occasion where I was getting it into the boot, and I was just pulling it, because there's a little lip where you have to take it over your seat that's down. And I was just pulling it over, and then all of a sudden a man comes, "Oh, I give you a hand," and then just shoved it into the boot, crushing my hand. And I was like, I didn't need your help. I had it all under control. But that was the extreme. It's like men get significance of being stronger than women, or proving that they're stronger than women. It happens all the time. And then we've got mansplaining, when men try to explain things that women actually already know. And they do it in such a patronizing, condescending way, like they're talking to a child. Women are intelligent. We don't need to be explained in such a patronizing way. If I don't understand something, I will ask for help. I mean, I know I'm stubborn, but I know my limitations, and I'm not afraid to ask for help. But I think it gives men status and makes them feel more important. So can you put up the image with the mirror? So since stepping into more and more leadership positions, I've had a few people, men in particular, who come along to over-encourage me, like I said earlier. Like, "Oh, well done, that was an amazing sermon, you did a really good job. Oh, well done for stepping out and taking that risk. Well done for doing your job." And I'm like, that's great. I don't actually need encouragement all the time. I love encouragement. I love feedback, because I think that's the way we grow. And leadership is hard, so it's nice to actually know that I'm doing a good job occasionally. But what is hard is when I give comments, encouragement from people, and I know Chris doesn't get it. Because people feel that I need the extra encouragement because I'm a woman. Yeah, I don't get negative feedback from people. It's like people are scared to complain about me or moan about me. And I know they do it. And is it because they're scared of me? Scared of making me cry? I may cry, that's okay, I'm okay with crying. The best way to encourage a woman in a position of leadership is to treat them like a man, because that's what it means to be treated as equal. And it sounds really simple, but it doesn't happen. Are you being genuinely egalitarian if you treat male and female leaders differently? Even though you may seek to encourage them both, maybe your encouragement comes out across in different ways. How comfortable are you at giving negative feedback to a woman? Do you respect a married woman with children more than a childless single woman? I do believe there is a hierarchy of women in the church, and the married women with family are at the top. The single childless woman is at the bottom. Do you say that you believe women are equal to men and can be in positions of leadership in the church? But does your behavior reflect that? This is why it's so important to go back to the Johari's window, to go back to that passage in James. Is there anything God is challenging you on? Does your behavior towards women, Does your behavior towards men reflect what you actually believe? Chris has often said, when he's been hearing my stories, what keeps you in the church when you've been so badly treated by people in the church? And I said, it's because of Jesus. Because I know that he loves me, that my significance comes from him alone. And I know that love is unconditional, and I'm secure in that. But I also know as his follower that I am told to love his church because that's his bride. And I'm told to love his church despite its many failings. And Jesus is the one who's given me the courage to keep pushing through. And in fact, he's the one who's actually pushed me forward when people have been trying to keep me back. My significance comes from being a child of God, not from what I do in the church and the fact that I'm a single childless woman. The core of our identity needs to be based on our identity in Jesus, nothing else. Our significance needs to come from God, nothing else. So where does your sense of self-worth and significance come from? Is it from your marriage or from your relationship status? Is it from your job or material possessions? Do you get your significance by what you do in the church? An easy way of thinking about that is, what would you do if all of that was taken away from you? If you were to ask to step down from positions in the church, how would that make you feel? Because that will show you where your significance really lies. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there. But yeah, I just want to say women can do all things. Our significance is more than our sex. We need to know who we are in God.